The sterile silence of a first-class cabin is shattered by a sound no one should ever hear: the crack of an open palm. A 9-year-old boy, Jackson Thorne, stands by his seat, his face burning, surrounded by passengers who look away in cowardly silence. The flight attendant, Leona Hayes, sneers. She thinks this injustice is over, but she is wrong. Hidden in Jackson's pocket is a device that just logged the strike, not as a complaint, but as a financial trigger. This isn't about yelling. It's about data. 10 minutes later, a ping in a Boston skyscraper would yank $11 billion out of 3 major airlines. Did you know that your silence is the most powerful evidence you have? Keep watching, because this story reveals how one quiet child brought an entire industry to its knees. You ever seen a quiet kid who just knew? Not a know-it-all, but someone with a stillness that felt heavier than 100 voices. That was Jackson Thorne, age 9. He sat in the first-class lounge at Atlanta's massive airport, a place built on the promise of effortless luxury. Jackson looked completely at ease in the quiet, exclusive space. His e-reader, a sleek little thing with a custom leather case, was just a device to everyone else. But to him, and to his grandmother, Althea Vance, it was a whole different kind of book. Althea, a force of nature in the ethics investing world, approached him. Her presence commanded respect, not because she was loud, but because her decisions moved markets. She wasn't here to say a dramatic goodbye. She was here for a final inspection. She adjusted the collar of Jackson's sharp blazer. "Remember what we talked about in the study," Althea said, her voice low. "The system is programmed for convenience, not fairness. When you cannot use your voice, use the tools." Jackson nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand, Grandma. The truth is recorded, not surrendered." Althea gave him a final knowing glance, a silent promise that whatever happened, he was covered. She then disappeared, leaving Jackson to board alone. On board Skylight Airways. Flight 871, bound for Chicago, the air shifted. Jackson calmly walked through the wide first-class aisle to his seat, 2A. That's when Leona Hayes appeared. Leona had spent 20 years in the air, her face set in a look of practiced cold courtesy. She intercepted Jackson, her smile tight. "Excuse me, son," she said, her voice condescending. "I think you're in the wrong cabin. I can show you to your seat in the back." Jackson, trained for this interaction, remained completely composed. He held up his boarding pass, the gold lettering clear. "This is my seat, 2A." Leona's smile vanished. Her frustration, rooted in years of quiet resentment over her own lack of advancement, boiled over. This was a challenge to her authority. "Look, I'm telling you, this is first class. This isn't where you belong," she insisted, leaning in close. Jackson stood his ground. In a move of sudden practiced aggression, Leona struck him. The crack of the slap cut through the cabin's low hum. Passengers, businessmen in expensive suits, vacationing couples, froze. They saw the red mark bloom instantly on Jackson's cheek. And then they looked away. They chose silence. Leona sneered, her eyes telling Jackson that she had won. But Jackson's stillness was terrifying. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He simply met her gaze, his eyes burning with quiet resolve. He moved to his assigned seat, sat upright, buckled his belt, and pulled out his e-reader. With a small, discreet tap, the screen flashed. A single line of code blinked. "Protocol Alpha 9 triggered. Class 1 bias event detected. Logging in progress." The device was now recording everything. Leona's body language, her proximity, the emotional stress levels of the cabin, the audio of her words, and the sound of the slap itself. It was a verified data packet, already speeding through satellite connection to a server 1,000 miles away. Jackson closed the e-reader and tucked it away. The external conflict had ended. The internal one, the one Leona had no idea she had started, was just beginning. He stared out the window, his silence a promise of retribution, not revenge. The narrative jumps to a sleek, modern office in Boston, the headquarters of the Fair Flight Initiative, FFI. It was a place where global finance and social ethics converged. We meet Kane Blackwell, the lead compliance analyst. Kane, a former programmer for the FAA, had left public service disillusioned. He now managed FFI's proprietary equity auditor system, a financial algorithm designed by Althea Vance to grade airlines on passenger treatment metrics. Kane was tracking real-time ethics data, the globe displayed on a massive screen like a nervous system under observation. Most of the dots were green, routine flights, nominal service. But then came the change. A single red dot blinked into existence over the eastern United States, linked to Skylight Airways Flight 871. It was labeled Protocol Alpha 9 Triggered. Kane leaned forward, a flicker of professional alarm in his eyes. Alpha 9, he muttered. That was the highest severity flag, reserved for verifiable explicit bias events involving a minor or vulnerable passenger. It was a notification designed to bypass all human screening. He tapped the screen. The initial data packet downloaded instantly. Source Thorne Jackson, 9. Location FLT 871, ATL ORD, F-Class, Seat 2A Incident, Assault Explicit Racial Bias. Corroboration, Biometric Data and Auditory Capture, verified. Kane ran the embedded file. It contained the clean, undeniable audio of the slap and Leona Hayes' voice stating, "This isn't where you belong." The accompanying graphic showed the flight attendant's stress levels and proximity patterns spike dramatically before the incident. Jackson's e-reader wasn't just a recorder, it was a forensic tool. "This is not a complaint," Kane whispered, recognizing the precision. "This is a deposition." He knew exactly what the device was. It was part of Althea Vance's system, designed specifically to address the kind of silent, invisible discrimination that the airlines routinely covered up. As Kane watched, the single red dot began to multiply. The Alpha 9 flag, because it verified an institutional failure, triggered an immediate automated cross-check on FFI's investment partners. 3 separate airline icons, Skylight, Voyager Aero, and Coastal Air, began flashing red. These airlines were linked by a shared portfolio dependent on FFI's ethics compliance score for access to major North American infrastructure funds. The red alerts started a cascading sequence across the corporate systems of all 3 airlines. Kane's initial confusion turned to cold, focused purpose. He watched the digital clock. It was barely 10 minutes since Jackson tapped the screen. A final urgent notification flashed on Kane's monitor, a non-negotiable directive from FFI's core algorithm. Financial embargo activated, $11 billion in pending capital frozen, compliance window 24 hours. Kane sat back, rubbing the tension from his temples. He knew this wasn't just a flight attendant losing her job. This was a 9-year-old boy in a first-class cabin, quietly collapsing a decade of systemic corporate arrogance. The first domino had fallen, and the entire aviation industry was about to feel the tremor. Most people don't know this, but one child's silent recording can change everything. If this story hit the headlines in your town tomorrow, wouldn't you want to know first? Subscribe now. Miles away from the quiet chaos brewing in the sky, the real storm was just beginning. It wasn't loud. It started with a subtle digital shudder felt in the boardrooms of 3 of the nation's biggest airlines. At Skylight Airways headquarters in Denver, Colorado, CEO Caleb Thorne stared at the alert on his tablet with a look of pure disdain. The message from the Fair Flight Initiative, FFI, was concise and formal. A Class 1 bias event had been logged on Flight 871. It demanded a full, transparent report on the incident within 24 hours. "Kane Blackwell?" Caleb scoffed, tossing the tablet onto the polished mahogany table. "That kid. I hired him fresh out of college to set up that little compliance dashboard. Now he's sending me ultimatums? This is a joke." His general counsel, Keisha Brooks, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had seen every kind of corporate arrogance, didn't laugh. She looked at the screen, and a bad feeling settled in her gut. "Caleb, this isn't from Kane. This is an automated Protocol Alpha 9 alert. It means the system didn't just log a complaint. It verified it with independent data. This comes directly from Althea Vance." The mention of Althea's name brought a tense silence to the room. The Fair Flight Initiative wasn't just some activist group. It was a powerful $11 billion fund that had a direct say in their financial stability. "Althea Vance is a crusader, not a CEO," Caleb said, his voice hard. "She can't touch us. We'll send a boilerplate response about employee conduct and an internal investigation. It's an empty threat." Across the country in Chicago, the boardroom of Voyager Aero was a whirlwind of similar dismissal. Their CEO, a man named Gideon Pierce, was on the phone with his lawyers. "An embargo? On what basis? A single passenger complaint?" "We have a whole team dedicated to suppressing these. This is a PR stunt, nothing more." He ordered his team to stonewall FFI and prepare a press release about their commitment to diversity. And in a sleek office overlooking the San Francisco Bay, the head of Coastal Air, a woman known for her cutthroat negotiating, simply deleted the email. "They can't prove a thing," she stated, confident that the incident would be swallowed by the silent complicity of the passengers and the closed-door investigation. The arrogance was palpable. The three airlines, confident in their size and influence, saw the FFI alert as a nuisance, a fly to be swatted away. They had spent years perfecting a system to ignore these issues, to make them disappear before they ever became a problem. They were prepared for a fight, a war of words and legal maneuvering. They were not prepared for what was about to happen. What these executives didn't understand was that this wasn't a game of chess. It was a single, precise shot. And the target wasn't the airline's reputation. It was its financial lifeblood. They believed their silence was a shield, but it was about to become the weapon used against them. The system, once their tool of control, was cracking from within, and a 9-year-old boy had provided the hammer. If you've ever felt like your voice was ignored, like you were invisible to a huge corporation, this is a story for you. We've all been there. What would you do if you could make them listen? Tell us in the comments. And if you don't want to be caught off guard by the next big story, subscribe now. It's the only way to be prepared. The clock on the wall of Skylight's boardroom read 8:15 a.m. The conversation was moving back to quarterly profits, the FFI alert already an afterthought. Suddenly, the door burst open. The airline's senior CFO, his face pale, stumbled in, phone still clutched to his ear. It's happening," he stammered, his voice laced with a genuine fear Caleb had never heard. Caleb stood up. "What's happening?" The CFO's eyes were wide. "Every one of our credit lines with the Vance Consortium, the investment renewals, they're all on hold, frozen. Our partners at JP Hawthorne and Global Capital Ventures just sent a unified message. All pending credit renewals frozen pending resolution of FFI ethics compliance." A stunned silence fell over the room. It was not a rumor. It was not a stunt. The threat was real. Caleb snatched the phone from the CFO. "What do you mean, frozen? This is a violation of our contract." The voice on the other end was cold, calm, and formal. "Mr. Thorne, you signed the Fair Flight Accord. Any Class 1 bias event flagged by a verified FFI device triggers an automatic review and financial embargo. We don't have a choice in the matter. It's in the fine print. The line went dead. Across the country, the same chaotic scene played out in two other boardrooms. At Voyager Aero, Gideon Pierce, who had just been boasting about his legal team, watched as his chief of staff handed him a printed sheet. It was a formal notification from Faro Equity, their biggest investor. All forward credit lines, including the one for their new fleet of Dreamliners, had been suspended indefinitely. The amount was staggering, $4 billion. At Coastal Air, the CEO who had so flippantly deleted the initial alert watched as her finance team frantically tried to make sense of the damage. A single, unified alert from multiple investment partners flashed across their screens. All capital aligned with FFI standards is now being reallocated. They lost a credit line for a key airport expansion in Seattle and another for their tech infrastructure overhaul. In total, a staggering $11 billion in capital was pulled from the three airlines. The executives, once so confident in their power, were now in a blind panic. They made frantic calls to banking partners, to lobbyists in Washington, to anyone who could pull a string. But every door was slammed shut. The system they thought they controlled had turned on them. The Fair Flight Accord wasn't a suggestion, it was a tripwire, and a 9-year-old boy had just stepped on it. This was the climax of the first act. The Goliath was bleeding not from a punch, but from a silent surgical strike. It was a stunning reversal of power, a moment where the unseen force of data proved to be more destructive than any physical act. For the first time, these executives felt what it was like to be powerless, to have their choices stripped away. And it was all because of a quiet little boy who had the courage to not react, but to simply record. To understand Jackson's stillness in that moment, you have to go back to a place of quiet purpose. Not a training camp or a dojo, but a sunroom in Althea Vance's home in Buckhead, Atlanta, 3 years earlier. This was a house that didn't echo with loud games, but with the soft clicking of keys and the rustle of blueprints. Jackson's parents were diplomats, always moving, always serving a greater mission. They entrusted Jackson to his grandmother, not as a burden, but as a legacy. Althea didn't see a child to be coddled. She saw a mind to be sharpened. She didn't teach Jackson to fight. She taught him to understand. Their chess games weren't about winning, but about seeing 3 moves ahead, about anticipating your opponent's unspoken strategy. She taught him that true power wasn't a show of force, but an understanding of systems. One afternoon, she sat him down in her study, a room with walls of books on finance, philosophy, and code. She slid a modified e-reader across the desk. It wasn't a toy. It was a tool. "This is not for making a scene," she told him. "Noise fades, screams are forgotten. But data is forever." She showed him how it worked. It connected to a closed network she called the Fair Flight Initiative. She called it a witness. It would lie dormant, a quiet observer, until a specific trigger, a raise in voice, a hostile movement, a condescending tone detected by its sensors, signaled a Class 1 bias event. Then it would begin to record. It wasn't about catching people in the act. It was about creating an undeniable record of the truth. Jackson, a boy who learned to communicate in code as much as in conversation, absorbed this. He spent hours with Althea, building logic puzzles, tracking supply chains, and simulating ethical dilemmas. He came to see the world not as a series of random events, but as a system of predictable inputs and outputs. He learned that anger was an output, and racism was an input, and that to fix the system, you had to target the input. He trusted her completely. An unspoken bond forged in silence and shared purpose. He knew she would never let him down. This wasn't just a lesson for him, It was a way of life. The slap on the plane wasn't a personal insult. It was a data point. The sting on his cheek was a physical feeling. The tap on his e-reader was the truth. It was all a part of the system Althea had built. It was a testament to the fact that his quiet strength was more powerful than any loud display of force. He wasn't a boy on a plane. He was a silent observer of a flawed system, equipped with a tool to make it acknowledge its own failure. And as he sat in that first-class seat, his cheeks still stinging, he had no doubt that Althea's system was already moving, and the truth he had recorded was about to become the loudest voice in the room. To the passengers on Flight 8721, Leona Hayes was a villain, a symbol of unchecked power and racism. But injustice doesn't happen in a vacuum. It often grows in the cracks of a system that has long been broken. We need to go back and look at the life of the woman behind that practiced smile. Leona was a career flight attendant, starting out in the golden age of air travel when the job felt more like a calling. She'd always followed the rules, kept her head down, and worked her way up. But she felt the quiet shifts in the industry. Her raises were smaller. Promotions went to younger, flashier recruits. The service with a smile she was hired for had become a performance, an emotional labor with no reward. A resentment, small at first, began to build. She felt the unspoken rules of the cabin. She saw how some passengers were treated like royalty while others were given the cold shoulder. She saw how complaints from some were ignored while others were immediately addressed. Over time, she began to internalize this unspoken bias. The system, once her proud domain, had become a prison. She wasn't just working, she was fighting for her place. The pressure built, invisible and constant. Jackson, a child she didn't know, was a symbolic challenge to her fragile sense of control. He was a small, quiet boy in a seat she felt belonged to someone else. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He was simply present, a small, quiet mirror of the unfairness she felt in her own life. In her mind, his very presence was an offense. The slap was not an outburst. It was a predictable, if horrific, result of a lifetime of resentment. Hours after the flight landed, Leona was at home, a suburb outside Chicago, trying to process the day. She had already brushed it off as a minor incident. That's when her phone rang. It was her supervisor, his voice tense. "Leona," he said, "the FAA just flagged you. What happened with the kid in 2A? Her hands started to shake. "It was nothing," she said, her voice strained. "A rude kid, a misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding," her supervisor replied. "You've been put on immediate leave. An ethics review is pending. This is coming from the top, Leona. The Fair Flight Initiative has our whole fleet on a financial watch list." Leona's phone clattered to the floor. The world she knew, the one where her actions vanished without consequence, was gone. She sat on the floor, staring at her shaking hands. She wasn't just in trouble for a slap. She was the focal point of a systemic collapse. It was a terrifying reality, one she was completely unprepared for. The system had finally turned on her, using the very power of silent observation she had wielded against others for years. The system had logged the incident, but the human element, the silent, complicit passengers, remained a problem for the airline. The executives at Skylight, Voyager Aero, and Coastal Air were in a frenzy, convinced that without a credible human witness, they could still find a loophole. They could claim Jackson's device was tampered with, the audio faked, or the boy himself was simply lying. Their lawyers were preparing a vigorous defense based on discrediting the data, but they had no idea that a different kind of truth was about to come forward. His name was Leo Carter, a junior flight attendant on the same flight. He had seen the whole thing, the arrogant confrontation, the shocking slap, and the boy's terrifying stillness. He had also seen how his co-workers immediately looked away, following an unspoken code of silence. Leo was new to the job, still full of the idealism that drew him to the profession. He had watched the drama unfold with a sense of dread, but his fear of losing his job had kept him from intervening. But as the days passed, a sense of guilt gnawed at him. The images of the boy's burning cheek and his quiet resolve haunted him. He saw the news stories, the corporate spin about a technical malfunction. He knew it was a lie, and his conscience wouldn't let him be a part of it. He took a risk. Using a personal email, he sent a short, anonymous message to the Fair Flight Initiative, directly to the email of Kane Blackwell. He didn't know who Kane was, but the name was listed on the FFI website. "I was on Flight 871. I saw what Leona did to the boy. It wasn't an isolated incident. This is a sickness in the crew culture." Kane, who had been expecting a legal battle, was stunned. He replied immediately, using a secure messaging app. Over the next few hours, Leo recounted everything. He described Leona's past, her resentments, and the toxic culture on board. He talked about how supervisors turned a blind eye to these acts of casual bias. He didn't just talk about the slap. He explained the entire system of quiet complicity that allowed it to happen. His testimony, combined with Jackson's irrefutable data, created a truly undeniable case. The data provided the proof, and Leo's story provided the context and the crucial human witness. The FFI didn't need to do any more investigating. They had everything. Kane sent a final, blunt message to the 3 airlines. "Your technical defense is obsolete. We have a verified internal witness with a detailed testimony on systemic bias. We will make this public at our next press briefing. Your 24-hour window for a full public apology is now a 3-hour countdown, and this time we suggest you mean it." The executives, who had been scrambling for a way out, were now trapped. They had no legal footing left. They couldn't dismiss Leo because his testimony was corroborated by a data packet that had already cost them billions. They had to pivot, and quickly. From a position of arrogant defiance, they were now forced into a humiliating public apology. This was the moment the quiet revolution became unstoppable. The data had exposed their financial weakness, and the human witness had exposed their moral rot. The two pieces, once separate, had come together to form an unbreakable truth. The media storm began not with a bang, but with a series of synchronized beeps. At 10 a.m. PST, every major news outlet received a press release from the Fair Flight Initiative. It included a link to a secure, unedited audio file and a summary of Leo's testimony. The headline was simple and devastating. FAA DOJ monitoring situation. It didn't have to say anything else. Within the hour, the story exploded. On CNN, Reuters, and major news websites, headlines screamed about the quiet revolution. They spoke of a 9-year-old taking on a billion-dollar industry and winning. The story of Jackson's quiet dignity and the devastating financial consequences of Leona's actions captivated the public. It wasn't just a story about racism, it was a story about accountability. The 3 airlines, having run out of options, held a joint press conference. They issued a carefully worded apology, promising unprecedented internal reviews and a renewed commitment to ethical standards. But the public wasn't buying it. People had already heard the truth, and no amount of corporate spin could erase the sound of that slap. The internet, as it always does, went to work. Hashtags like "The Quiet Revolution" and "Justice for Jackson" trended globally. People shared their own stories of airline bias and systemic injustice. The story went viral not just because it was shocking, but because it validated the experiences of millions of people who had felt ignored. Jackson and Althea watched the news from a small cafe in Chicago. He saw his face, the media's scramble to find the whistleblower boy. They didn't use his name, but insiders knew. Jackson, a boy who had spent his life in quiet observation, was now the face of a national movement. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He hadn't shouted or fought. He had simply used a tool to make a broken system fix itself. He sat at the table, a cup of hot cocoa between his hands, an island of calm in the chaotic storm they had created. Althea smiled at him, a look of immense pride on her face. She didn't need to ask him if he was scared. She knew he wasn't. They had planned for this. They had prepared for this moment. A moment when the world would finally listen to what they had been trying to say all along. It was a victory, not just for them, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The revolution wasn't loud. It was silent, undeniable, and it had just begun. The financial shockwave that stripped $11 billion from 3 major airlines was just the opening act. The final confrontation wouldn't be settled in a courtroom or a PR war. It would be fought over policy and data integrity. The systemic cracks Jackson exposed demanded a structural repair. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, already facing mounting public pressure, had no choice but to intervene. 2 weeks after the financial embargo, the FAA commissioner announced a mandatory compliance summit in Washington, D.C. This wasn't a friendly industry meeting, it was an ultimatum. Every major domestic airline was required to attend and present their internal data on service disparities and ethical failures. The main event, however, was the presentation scheduled for the final day. Althea Vance, founder of the Fair Flight Initiative, was invited to present her equity auditor system as a potential new industry standard. The summit room was heavy with tension. CEOs and general counsels who had dismissed Althea's work for years now sat sweating in the audience. She didn't walk in with lawyers or security. She walked in with Kane, Blackwell, and Jackson. Jackson, dressed in his blazer, sat quietly in the front row, his e-reader resting on his lap. His presence was a silent, powerful indictment of the entire room. Althea didn't waste time with philosophical speeches. She presented data. On the massive screen behind her, the FFI team projected the cumulative results of the Alpha 9 protocol over the last 3 years. Incidents the airlines had successfully buried. She showed heat maps detailing which routes, which terminals, and most shockingly, which specific flight crew members showed the highest verified bias scores. Then, she played the audio from Flight 871. The room went completely silent. They heard Leona Hayes's condescending tone, the sound of the slap, and Jackson's quiet response. The audio was immediately followed by a graphic that overlaid Jackson's biometric data. His heart rate remained steady, his tone even, and Leona's data, her vocal stress soaring off the charts. The data proved Jackson's composure and Leona's aggression. "This is not a complaint," Althea's voice cut through the silence. "This is irrefutable truth. The data proves the system is not broken by bad apples. It is fundamentally designed to allow this behavior to happen without consequence." She then introduced the solution. The Fair Flight Initiative, FFI, wasn't just a fund. It was the mechanism for repair. She explained how the equity auditor system, powered by Jackson's small device, forces accountability. Ethics, Althea concluded, looking directly at the CEOs, are no longer a matter of policy you can ignore. They are now a non-negotiable part of your financial bottom line. Compliance isn't about being good, it's about being solvent. The FAA commissioner, visibly moved by the presentation, took the microphone. He announced the FAA would begin the process of implementing the FFI's ethical metric framework as a mandatory requirement for all commercial flight certifications. Failure to comply would result in license suspension. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a revolution enforced by the government. The reaction was chaos. CEOs huddled calling their legal teams. Keisha Brooks, Skylight's general counsel, approached Althea and Jackson. She didn't look angry. She looked defeated. "You won, Althea," Keisha admitted. "But why use the child? Why let him face this exposure?" Althea looked down at Jackson, who returned the gaze with his steady, quiet eyes. "He didn't face the exposure, Keisha. He initiated the reckoning. He proved that when the most vulnerable person in the room has the right tools, the most powerful people are forced to listen. The fallout was immediate and vast. Leona Hayes was terminated, her actions now public record. Caleb Thorne and the CEOs of Voyager Aero and Coastal Air were forced into emergency resignations. The narrative had shifted entirely. Jackson, the quiet, prepared boy, became the accidental face of accountability, proving that the silent truth, when properly recorded, could reshape the sky for everyone. The legacy wasn't just about the money lost. It was about the rules rewritten 1 year later. The hustle of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport still thrummed with activity, but something fundamental had changed. The atmosphere was different, subtly, quietly better. Jackson and Althea were back at the same gate, preparing for a flight. Jackson, now 10, was taller but still carried the same profound stillness. He wasn't a prodigy who sought fame. He was a boy who sought fairness. He approached the gate counter. This time, the gate attendant, a young woman named Dina, didn't hesitate. She looked at his boarding pass, smiled a genuine, warm smile, and handed it back. "Welcome aboard, Jackson," she said. He looked up, surprised that she knew his name, but not by the kindness. On board the plane, the difference was even more stark. The cabin crew, attentive and courteous, were universally professional. There was no condescension, no microaggressions. A flight attendant passed his seat and knelt briefly, offering him a premium snack. Her tablet, discreetly mounted on her service cart, carried a small, bright sticker, FFI certified, ethics score A+. The quiet revolution had become the unwritten rule. Althea watched him from her seat, a deep satisfaction in her eyes. The FFI system was now the gold standard. Airlines across the country and globally had adopted the ethical metric framework. Training manuals were rewritten. Flight crew contracts now explicitly included clauses about bias detection and automatic review. The sky itself had been subtly rearranged to protect dignity. Jackson settled into his seat, the peaceful feeling settling over him. He took out his e-reader. It wasn't logging anything. It was a normal e-reader now. The core Alpha 9 protocol had been hard-coded into the airline's own systems, making individual recording redundant. The power was no longer in his hands. It was baked into the infrastructure. The purpose of the system was never revenge. It was to ensure that the next child, the next person, would never have to experience that kind of silent injustice again. He turned to Althea. "We did it right," he said softly. "We did it quietly," she corrected. "And that's what made it last." The plane taxied toward the runway, a smooth, uneventful journey ahead. Jackson closed his eyes, thinking not of the slap, but of Leo's courage, Althea's foresight, and the truth of the data. He had used silence to create a sound so loud, it forced the world to listen. We are constantly taught that to achieve justice, we must raise our voices. But Jackson Thorne taught us a different, more powerful lesson. He proved that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not to fight back, but to quietly record the truth and trust that the system can be forced to listen to data. The sky belongs to everyone, and now that truth is finally coded into the air itself. Tell me in the comments, if you had the power to install the equity auditor in one place, your workplace, your school, or your neighborhood, Where would it be? Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story that changes the rules.